great.
Thanks for coming up here and doing this.
I am super happy to be here.
Our mutual friend, Jeff Gordonier, is the one who keyed me on to everything that you're up to. And I'm excited to talk to you, man.
I'm excited
Lots
to
of
talk
stuff
to you
to talk
also.
about.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff's a pretty awesome dude and has been really supportive, has been a really good friend to me.
You did an event with him recently, right?
He came to an event that I was a part of recently. I did a reading near Jeff and I live in the same town, and then worked details together for many years also. So like a bunch of those stories that he talked about when he was on your podcast,
the Keanu Reeves sandwich story,
the Keanu Reeves sandwich story, the sex doll repair, the repairman. That was details. But I did this event in New York and near where we live, and Jeff came to show his support.
Yeah, cool.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, he texted me this morning just to make sure that I was, like all up to speed on everything, and he reminded me of just what a heyday it was at Details during that time. I mean, you were really there at a period where magazines were hyper relevant. And you had quite, the long leash to work with all kinds of amazing writers and really indulge long form storytelling in a way that you just don't see that often now.
I like to think that I got to ride the last great wave of magazine publishing. Now, that's not to say that there's still not great stuff going on in magazines today, because of course there is. But back then, when we relaunched Details in 2000, there were still huge budgets, like you said, incredibly long leash, really the tons of autonomy, the ability to do what we wanted to do and send writers off on crazy adventures and then have them come back and publish, 6, 7, 8,000 words. Which was a real treat and something that's a little bit more rare today.
And deploy these amazing writers like Jonathan Safran Foer and Augustine Burroughs, who blurbed your book, and all these incredible literary talents.
Yeah, so we were able to sort of tap into that and give them the opportunity to write and go for it. And it seems like that has sort of dried up a little bit, obviously, but it really was. It felt like a golden era, and I was really I'm super grateful to have been a part of that,
Well, your story and the book is, it's sort of equal parts. It's like a toned down. It's like a toned down version or an insecure person's telling of a bright lights, big city type narrative. You know what I mean? Like you mute the kind of high wire act of editing this, very prominent magazine and kind of navigating, the canyons of Lower Manhattan and all of that. But when I think about like that time and what you were doing, that was like a rock star job that you had.
It was, and one that I was in no way ready for. And that's not like false humility. Like, no, they shouldn't have given it to me. No, they shouldn't have given it to me. But, they gave me this job running Details. I was 28 years old. I had never run anything like that.
Well, you were running W in Paris prior to that, right?
I was running W Magazine's European bureaus prior to that. But that, it was a very lean operation, by comparison.
Right.
So then I was given this job at Details and moved back to New York and had to kind of figure all of this stuff out and had to hire a team and I had never really done any of that before.
And what's interesting is you don't like sort of cut the figure of the person you expect to be in that job. First of all, you were super young. But you're like, you talk about this in the book, like you're listening to Hootie and the Blowfish. Even though you were W, like you don't really care about fashion. Like how do you end up with it being in this arbiter of style and culture?
Well, I think just a quick word about my taste in music, because I've just been
Jeff must give you a lot of shit about that.
Oh man, you have no idea.
Because he's got like his taste is dialed.
I mean, and listen, with all due respect to Hootie and the Blowfish,
God love them.
I wouldn't even put them that high on my list. I mentioned them in the book
Rick
for sure.
Springfield.
But it was like I'm a child of the 80s, right? I mean, I was born in the 70s, but like I really started kind of like absorbing culture in the 80s. And so like for me in Baltimore, it was stuff like, it was like Journey and Foreigner and Styx and bands like that. And so that just sort of stuck with me. So Journey in particular is something that people just like are merciless about when they tease me, people, because you're right. You're absolutely right. Here I was now running this magazine, and I would have all these editors who were plugged in. Some had worked at Rolling Stone and Spin, and they knew these worlds, and they would come to me to pitch stories on bands that like I had just only maybe even just heard of, in some cases had not heard of. And then you have people like Jeff and others who are like music, freaks and junkies, that were like, oh man, like, can we do something a little different, a little new agey, whatever the case may be. But yeah, it wasn't a job. I wasn't an obvious person for that role. But I think that's what led them to want to give it to me. I think they wanted to try something different. I think that the men's magazine landscape at that time was changing very quickly. This was the era of what we called the lad magazines, like Maxim and Stuff and things like that, and pretty like TNA driven and things like that. That just wasn't necessarily something that appealed to me.
Right.
So and the team that I assembled, we came up with this concept basically of creating a magazine for men, not necessarily beer and babes and barbecue and sports, but a new type of guy who could stand on his own 2 feet in lots of different ways and didn't need to have a woman in a wet t-shirt on the cover of a magazine in order for him to be like, oh, cool, I'll pick that up. So we started to kind of look at things a little differently.
Yeah, it tapped the metrosexual zeitgeist nerve, I suppose, and it kind of gave guys permission to care about things like style and cool music and stuff like
and
that,
skincare and
like
things.
Right.
Totally.
Did you know a guy named Jamie Hooper who ran Maxim?
The name sounds familiar, but no.
I'm a little bit older than you, but he was one of the guys that I ran around New York with when I was living there, like way back in the day.
I feel like there were lots of guys like that, and this was what. And by the way, at this time in our culture, right around 2000 or even the late 90s, this was all there was. Like this stuff was booming, absolutely booming. This was the approach to talking about masculinity, and it was like fart jokes and like the hottest women in bikini competitions, vote online now, and so like, and that, when I looked at that, I was like, hey, listen, that just doesn't like appeal to me, and so we kind of cobbled together this magazine that, you're right, I think tapped the metrosexual vein and allowed us to look at with a broader sort of filter things that were affecting men's lives and things that men should care about, where previously you didn't see too many guys sort of like openly embracing a love of, aftershave or whatever, or cooking or architecture or design, whatever it is,
I remember just sort of thinking as I would page through that magazine around that time, during that period of time, like, is this for gay dudes or is this for me? Like, is this like, it was sort of, it had a gay slant, but it wasn't overtly gay. Like it was meant to kind of capture that audience, but also be broader.
That's exactly right. Yeah. It was meant to sort of smash the stereotype of what's a guy today, and we did everything that we could to sort of blur the line between gay and straight. And so we would do stories that people would look at and be like, "Hey, whoa, like what? Like, am
It's
I
a little bit too far out there for me?
as a straight guy, should I be reading this?" But the beauty of it is that it wasn't designed to be a magazine for everyone. And so we knew who our audience was, and the audience grew very quickly, and the audience responded to what we were doing. And I would just often say, like, "Hey, like if what we're doing is like bothering you, or if you feel like it's sort of putting your masculinity or your idea of masculinity at risk, then cool, you don't have to read it, you know, and that was fine. But to kind of blur that line a little bit and talk to men who may have been straight or may have been gay, and aside from their sexual preference, had all of the same interests. And so this was our guy.
Right.
And so, but certainly not every guy. There's no question about it. You know?
Yeah. And perhaps not even you. Right. That's the irony, right?
And
like
perhaps not
you don't cut the figure of like the details reader, which is interesting.
It is interesting because at the time when we relaunched the magazine with this sort of new approach to making content, I was out doing lots of press and promoting the magazine, saying it's for guys like me. And meanwhile, I'm in a pair of like Converse All-Stars and like ripped up jeans and a t-shirt and a hoodie, you know. But I had just been living in Paris for almost 3 years and had been exposed to the kind of European or kind of continental sense
could, like,
of
talk the language. And,
absolutely, you know. And I would look at these guys, you know, and I'd be like, oh, you know, that guy's definitely gay. And then like this, like, you know, beautiful wife would you know throw up. But like I was like looking at him and the way he had like his scarf wrapped around his neck, and the way the suit maybe was a little more tapered than the average American guy's suit, or you know, listening to him talk about wine or art or whatever it is. And I was like, oh wow, like this is a really interesting approach to masculinity. But no, I absolutely wasn't that guy. I think I grew a little bit to become that guy, but I was so deeply insecure with who I was. I if I'm being perfectly honest with you, I don't think I know what kind of guy I was, you know. I really don't. And so it allowed me just to kind of be a journalist and react to where I felt the culture was going, which is what I think we did at Details.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's take it back. Let's play a little game I know you're familiar with called What It Was Like, What Happened, and What It's Like Now.
I know.
You know the structure of this. So, so you're from New York. You grew up in the suburbs outside of New York.
I grew up in Baltimore.
Oh, in Baltimore. That's right. Yeah. I'm from DC. So
whereabouts?
right there, Bethesda.
Yeah. So okay,
not too far.
Same thing.
A lot of lacrosse. I know your brother was a big lacrosse star.
Exactly. A lot of lacrosse. You know, a lot of star athletes. Lot of you know, crab cakes. A lot of you know, whales on belts and things like that.
Exactly.
Also.
Did you go to public high school? Or?
I went to private high school,
What?
actually. I went to a school called Boys Latin.
Oh, yeah. So there's Boys Latin in Gilman.
That's exactly
right.
right.
I went to Landon. So
okay.
Probably. Yeah. My high school probably played lacrosse against you guys.
I'm sure. I'm sure you did. You would not have played against me.
Not
though.
Me neither.
Okay.
You know, I wasn't partaking in that world at all.
But yeah. So yeah, I grew up. That's where I grew up down
right.
there.
Cool. And you end up going to NYU. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So walk me through just your introduction to New York.
Oh man, I was in love with New York from the moment I went on my first visit, probably when I was 13 or 14. It felt like the perfect place for me because it seemed like the ideal place for someone to just kind of get lost in a crowd, and that's what I wanted to do. You know, we talk about these lacrosse guys, and if you have, you know, listeners out there that don't know this culture, it's a really interesting culture, right? I mean, it's akin to football in Texas or you know, basketball in different parts of the country and soccer now, of course. So, but it's at the time anyway, it was like super broy. Guys were like dipping this was this world that I didn't belong to, nor really did I aspire to.
Duck shoes.
Totally. Duck shoes or Bucks.
Yeah.
And like faded jeans and polo shirts, with a collar up.
Right.
It was stuff that like John Hughes and others I think have documented also incredibly well, but it just wasn't my world. And so when I first went to New York, I was like, oh wow, cool. Like this works for me because I can kind of escape here and maybe even kind of reinvent myself or recreate myself here. So I loved it from the moment I got there.
Right. What's interesting about your story is that you would suspect or predict that that young person in New York City gets introduced to drugs and alcohol pretty rapidly, and the love affair and the decline would begin almost immediately.
Right.
But that's not your story.
That's not my story. I was always in love with journalism. So while like those sort of like kids, there were the lacrosse kids. I was like the high school newspaper guy. I was like super into magic tricks and like studying magic and stuff like that, which I did like from like for as far back as I can remember. And so here I am in New York and, like home of every major media outlet. And I was like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And I kind of started working for the NYU school paper and was taking these journalism courses. And when you take journalism courses at NYU, at least back then, the professors would bring in, big media figures as guest lecturers and things like that. So Dan Rather, who at the time was anchoring the CBS Evening News, came in and spoke, and big newspaper writers and magazine editors were the faculty of the NYU journalism program. So it was just absolutely amazing. And listen, I started drinking a little bit, smoking some pot and things like that. But I wasn't going out. There were kids that got to NYU at 18 that just embraced the New York City nightlife in ways that I did not, and they would go to all of these hot clubs and this and that. And, this was back at the time where Randy Gerber was just starting to sort of like open up tons of places in and around New York, and they would go to these places and I just didn't do that, but, no, my love affair with drugs, like with so many things in my life, I was a late bloomer.
Right.
And loss of my virginity, introduction to drugs, like lots of stuff.
Just a good Jewish boy.
Just a good Jewish boy from the suburbs of Baltimore, you know.
So the first main gig that you get is at the Times, right? New York Times?
I was a copy boy at the New York Times, and back when they had copy boys. I don't even know if that's something that exists there anymore, but it was such an amazing thing. The Times building has since moved, but they were back in Times Square on 43rd Street, and they actually had press. They would actually printed a portion of the papers right there
in the building,
on the ground floor of the building, and trucks would roll out right from that main floor. It was incredibly romantic. If you were a lover of journalism and a student of journalism, this was like the ideal, being there and being in that newsroom. And it was a really kind of amazing experience for me. But I also I got reprimanded once for whistling. I'm not like a whistler, but for some reason I was like, and literally some editor was like, hey, no whistling in the newsroom. I was like, whoa. Got it. Yeah. All right. But they would send me down. I worked like a 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, or maybe it even was a little bit longer than that. And they would send me down to the press room to pick up first run copies, and I would bring a stack up to the newsroom and would like hand them out to the various sort of news desks, and would have ink all over my hands and my wrists. So you talk about, there's this expression in journalism, it being an ink stained wretch, and that's like I literally was. So it was a very cool place to be.
Did you think you were gonna stay there and work your way up?
100%.
Yeah,
I had every intention of being a journalist in the mold of like David Halberstam or Woodward and Bernstein, absolutely.
So where does the magazine thing start to come about?
The magazine thing, well, listen, I couldn't get a job. I graduated at NYU with a degree in journalism, or a dual degree, also history, but main focus on journalism, and sent out like old school in envelopes with stamps into mailboxes, tons of resumes, and just got like a flurry of, hey, we'll keep your resume on file letters like back at me, including one from Details magazine, interestingly. And so I was just desperate for a job. I wanted to stay in New York, but time was running out from a financial standpoint. And I ended up getting a job at a company called Fairchild Publications, which has changed a lot over the years, but at the time published Women's Wear Daily and a number of other papers and magazines, including W Magazine.
So you say you're a late bloomer, but it seems like you didn't waste too much time moving up quickly.
It's interesting. I think like late bloomer with like everything
life experience
with everything related to life experience, with the exception of my career. And so no, my career moved very quickly, and it's puzzling to many, myself included. But
it's that self-deprecating thing.
It is
the insecurity.
It is. Well, listen.
Obviously, you're very good at what you do. I mean, listen, you held, these two, pretty prominent posts, and you held the Details post for 15 years.
I did.
So.
Yeah, like my career has been pretty amazing, and I feel blessed. I really do. And I have a lot of gratitude for that, and for the fact that I was able to hold on to the Details job. But I was a copy boy at the New York Times. I started then. I became a research editor, a research assistant, or like fact checker, basically, at Esquire magazine, which I had always loved. And then I got this job working initially at Fairchild Publications for a publication that's no longer around. It was called the Daily News Record, or DNR. Which was the male equivalent of Women's Wear Daily. So it covered the
like industry rag for fashion
for men.
Yeah.
And I was a knitwear, sweaters and knitwear editor. And I dove into that with all the gusto that any journalist on a new beat should. But very shortly after I got that job, really like within 6 months, I was asked if I wanted to come over to Women's Wear Daily for a really coveted job there on what was the I page, EYE I page. And that was their like party and events coverage. So I went literally from like covering sweater manufacturers, and going to conventions of like knitwear companies, to going out and covering movie premieres and going to all of these events and meeting and interacting with all of these like extraordinary cultural figures within the period of like 6 months.
And then how long before they ship you off to Paris?
I got shipped off to Paris probably 3 years after that, 3 or 4 years after that.
Yeah, that must have been crazy.
It was
being
nuts.
there, going to like fashion shows and, hanging out with Karl Lagerfeld and like all these, wacky people from that world.
It was a very weird time for me because that hadn't been my life and that hadn't been my passion. And
yeah, you weren't like the kid who was reading,
nope,
those magazines as a kid.
I'm afraid not.
Yeah,
but what I was a journalist and was an editor who really loved storytelling and really loved to get people to talk. So even this, me being on the other side of this conversation is something that I'm not entirely comfortable doing. This is not my comfort zone.
Well, you got a book out, so you got to get comfortable with this.
Absolutely, and I'm working through it.
Yeah.
But I really preferred and still do to be on the other side and to be the one asking the questions and kind of drawing the story out. So whether or not I had an interest in fashion, I didn't even speak French. Right. Let's start there. You know, they said, hey, how would you feel about going and running the Paris office for W Magazine? And I was like, great. You know, I was 25.
Yeah.
And I was like, cool. Okay, what do I need to do? You know, well, how do you speak any French? I was like, no, I don't. And started to take some lessons, which I didn't really pay very close attention to, which is like a huge regret.
Well, one of the things that was interesting about that time that I read about you is that, this, I guess you could consider it a weakness that you didn't have this inherent like affinity for this world or this knowledge base for it, but you turn that into a strength. So when you're interviewing these people, instead of talking to them about the things that everyone's asking them about, you're asking them about their personal lives.
Totally.
And they would find that refreshing. And that was kind of a way to emotionally connect with the people that you were covering and engender their trust and, maybe get something a little bit more interesting out of them.
And I think that's absolutely true. But I also think that as a journalist, that's actually hugely important to do whatever it is you're covering. Now look, if you're covering a political race or you're covering some community board meeting in some small town, you want to sort of stick to what you're there to sort of write about as a journalist. But if you're having conversations about feature stories, you want to make a connection with the subject, the person that you're talking to, and even identify with them if you can, and be empathetic, whatever the case may be. So I was kind of dropped into this world where these people, these men and women, these fashion designers, these icons had been talking for their lives and careers about hemlines and fabric selection and things like that, and I would come in and be like, tell me about your childhood, or what did you have for breakfast this morning, or when was the last time you just went for a walk around town? I once it was with Karl Lagerfeld, the designer for Chanel, and I was talking to him. I was like, when was the last time you just walked around Paris? And he's like, well, my dear boy, I cannot walk around Paris, and you're right, because it was like a walking caricature of himself, right, with the ponytail and the fan and all of that. But
does he literally always have the fan?
I spent a lot of time with him. I did, and I honestly don't know if I ever saw a fan. I may have seen one like resting on a table somewhere, but it was certainly not like some prop,
Okay.
So I was able to kind of find a way in and develop relationships with these people and cover them in ways that were maybe a little bit different,
right? So you get the call for Details, 2000.
Yeah. I got the call for Details in 2000, and Details had been around for many years. Details was a really amazing magazine. It was founded in the 80s by a brilliant woman named Annie Flanders, and it was very sort of downtown and plugged into the club scene and a whole level of the culture that just wasn't even on my radar, and was ultimately purchased by Condé Nast, Cy Newhouse, who ran for many years Condé Nast magazines, which publishes Vogue and The New Yorker and Vanity Fair and all of that. And then it had a couple. It had James Truman was a great editor there, and they had really sort of built it up. But as they were building it up, like I said before, the whole landscape regarding men's magazines specifically was shifting into something that was kind of seeping into our culture from England, which were these magazines that were rooted more toward like the sort of lad culture, beer and babes. And
Maxim was really the kind of touchstone of all of that.
Maxim was the holy grail of that, and then there were like a number of competitors sort of started to crop up to try to sort of grab their share of that business because Maxim just like exploded onto the culture and in ways that men's magazines had never even really seen before. And so at Condé Nast, they tried to turn Details into a magazine like that. They actually hired the former editor-in-chief of Maxim, a guy named Mark Golan, to come in and kind of maximify Details. And it just didn't work. And ultimately, it really didn't even fit in with the sort of broader kind of corporate Condé Nast identity of luxury and sophistication and culture. You know, these are the people that, you know, did Condé Nast Traveler and The New Yorker. And then all of a sudden they were trying to do this, like, hey, how do we compete in this world of men's magazines? And that didn't work. So they shut it down and they were going to relaunch it. And they asked me if I wanted to be the editor-in-chief that did that.
So the idea being, rather than try to compete in that world, to counter program against it and find a niche with a different audience.
Right. I mean, let's find some white space here, you know, and anyone that does any kind of branding, you know, like you don't want to just jump into a crowded market and do the same thing that the market leaders are doing, right? You can do that, and we saw that with people trying to imitate Maxim, but it's certainly smarter to try to find a different path and or to maybe reach an audience that feels underserved by the kind of current constellation of magazines.
Yeah.
And so that's what we ended up doing.
So much of the job seems to be having your finger on the pulse of like what's cool now. Like you have to really be dialed into Lower Manhattan, right? And like what is actually happening that like the rest of America isn't aware of, that's kind of percolating in those subcultures.
Right. It was finding the trend before it was a trend. It was being, you know, just early enough on an idea and then, you know, sharing that with your audience. You know, you could be too early and it would go nowhere. And then if you were late, everyone had already sort of seen the idea. So it was just kind of trying to get it at the exact moment when it was just before it became a thing. And hoping actually that your story on it is what helped make it a thing.
Yeah.
You know?
So then your job is to find the people. Because I mean, if you're like listening to Rick Springfield and Hootie and the Blowfish, man, you don't seem like the right guy. But I would imagine your talent is like knowing who those people are and recruiting them to be part of this team.
I think taste in music aside, and I'm
just using that as an example of.
But that's a good example. Poor Rick Springfield, man. Jesse's Girl. Listen. You're in your car.
Nothing but love.
If Jesse's Girl comes on, tell me you don't just take a moment,
it's
particularly
all good.
If you're alone. You know, turn that up a tiny little bit.
All right, I'll give you that.
All right.
But I think even Rick Springfield would say, yeah, it's probably not cool.
He probably would.
Yeah.
But a lot of love for you, Rick. Yes, I think I was able to put together a team of people that could find those things of like cool hunters and people that understood the culture and could see what was coming and were tapped in really important ways in lots of different categories. So, you know, food, you know, bar culture, music, certainly, entertainment, travel, also fashion, obviously, all sorts of things. And then they would come to me and say, hey, this is what's kind of percolating out there. And I think my strength was the ability to say, okay, this is a story, this isn't a story. Yeah. Or, hey, how do we find a way into this story? You know, what is this? What makes sense here for our reader based upon what you're telling me? So you're right. Like, I was never the guy that was the cool hunter. I was never cool, period. And so, but I had the ability to say, hey, that's cool. And so that's what made me able to do my job. But no, if you dropped me in Lower Manhattan, listen, I know people, we've all grown up with people that you put them anywhere. I still know people today, I'm 48, that like you kind of put them anywhere and
they
really,
find it.
They find it
right
and
away.
all of a sudden they know the coolest people. Oh, I just got invited to this one, by this one. I was never that guy, but I was able to find those people and in turn find some pretty interesting stories.
But you would still have to, I mean, I remember reading details when Truman was the editor, and there's always, I mean, this is a thing with these kind of magazines. There's, you see Graydon Carter doing this, when he was editing Vanity Fair, but like that, the beautiful photo of the editor and then the letter right at the beginning, right? And the editor always looks super cool in some, get up or whatever. And then you have to write this thing about what's going to be in the issue and kind of synopsize like what's happening right now. Was that challenging for you? Like, I would imagine you did that, right?
I did.
They dress you up and make you look.
I wrote the letter, but there was never a photo.
There was never a photo.
There was never a photo of me on that page. Here we go back to like the sort of insecurity theme. I never liked being photographed. This isn't being recorded, is it? I was never comfortable in front of a camera, and I hated like being at an event and having someone say, "Hey, let's get your picture."
And that's your job. I mean, you talk about this in the book, just going to all of these crazy events that most people, a lot of people would kill to be able to attend. And you're a wallflower, and you got publicists yanking on you, take a picture with this person and that person, and you just not wanting to do it.
Right. And I think like I'll try to sort of like draw out the distinction between being a wallflower and not wanting to have my photo taken. I could maneuver around the room. I really have always enjoyed talking to people. And I could do that with relative ease. It was and I write about this in the book, you're right, where like I would be at some event that I was hosting for like some Hollywood celebrity, and they would be like, "Oh, hey, Dan, let's get a picture of you and so-and-so." And it would literally be the superhero from the superhero movie. And I would have to stand there with him. And as I write in the book, I always felt like the before photo in like some plastic surgeon's office, next to this like chiseled guy with like this chiclet smile and like abs that you could see through a suit. And like, I was kind of like just never really feeling it. So the beauty of being the editor-in-chief of the magazine was that when it came to that letter from the editor that had to go in every issue, I could just say, "Hey, we're not going to put a photo of me on this page." And that just became the norm.
Because you were the boss.
Because I was the boss.
Right. All right, well, let's get to the drugs.
Yeah.
It all starts with a cartwheel.
It does. Oh, man. I have done lots of stupid things in my life, and I detail many of them actually in my book. But perhaps the stupidest, and maybe the one, if not even maybe, I think the one thing that actually I think forever changed the course of my life was the cartwheel. And I think men have done so many dumb fucking things over the years to impress women. I mean, countless. In my case, it was a cartwheel. And so here I was in my early 20s. I was working still at Women's Wear Daily, covering these parties and things like that, movie premieres and stuff like that, and was meeting up with a couple of friends, and we were in the lobby of an office building in Lower Manhattan, and this friend came off the elevator, one of the guy that me and another friend were there to meet, and was with like 3 or 4 young women, and was introducing us and said, "Hey, so-and-so just got a job promotion." And I was like, "Oh, that's amazing. But can she do this?" And I attempted a cartwheel, which it's important to note, I had never done before. And it looked as if I had never done one before, because I came crashing down on the floor and hurt my back. So, but this was like me like seeking attention. This was me like this is like a theme throughout my entire life. Really, was like where am I getting validation from here? And how am I getting eyes on me? And in this instance, it was going to be a cartwheel, and I did it, and I hurt my back, and I went to see a doctor probably a day or two later, and was prescribed Vicodin, and that's how the seed was planted for me, and took this Vicodin, ultimately had back surgery, 2 back surgeries actually on my lower back, and was essentially off to the races, with opiates.
Was it that thing where the first time you took it, you just knew?
It wasn't until the 3rd or 4th time, which was still within a matter of a couple of days of taking it.
Well, initially, if the pain is severe enough,
right,
it mutes any kind of high that you're going to experience.
Exactly. And so I think when I first took it, it did exactly what it was prescribed to do, which was mellow out the whatever pain I was feeling. But it was only really a day or two later that I realized, oh, wow, this is how I want to feel, I mean, you just saw me, like I just took a deep breath.
Answer to every question I ever had, right? Or
well, it's
the solution to every problem I didn't know that I had.
Oh, it's like, this is what I've been looking for. This is going to make me feel like me. This is what I need. Like I'm home. And it was the beginning of at least what I thought was like a really important love affair, if I'm being honest,
Yeah.
And it happened incredibly quickly.
Well, the thing that gets a couple observations. I mean, first of all, the thing that gets missed in stories like this often is the love affair aspect of it. Like it does work for a period of time.
Oh my God,
it's serving some need, right? And it's fascinating how people find their way. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people like find their way to the drug that does something that feels like it's that missing puzzle piece in their life.
And it was for me. And so, I had grown up in Baltimore. I was the younger brother of like one of the town stars, like a golden boy in town, my brother Jeff, whom I love dearly. And he was the captain of the lacrosse team, which in that kind of like lacrosse obsessed environment was like icon status, right? He was, he went to Cornell. He was like, on his way to the Ivy League. He was great looking and had tons of girlfriends. And I was the sort of the little brother who like did magic tricks in the basement and wasn't any of those things. And so, and this takes me to the Cartwheel even, like, it's just like, I was like seeking something, and I just had never found it. And so with the Cartwheel, it was seeking validation or appreciation or trying to get a laugh or trying to get a girlfriend. I mean, who the hell does a cartwheel to get a girlfriend, or a date even, not even a girlfriend, but that's sort of where I was. So by the time I took these Vicodin, I was a seeker, and I was searching for something, and it was that missing piece for me, and it was amazing. I don't want to glamorize, any kind of drug use, if I'm being honest, but in that moment, it was like being enveloped by, it was just being like embraced in a way that I had never been embraced.
The warm blanket.
It's the warm blanket, as I describe. Exactly. It was like being just wrapped in a warm blanket, and it was like, oh, this is how I should feel.
And not prior to that, like no real, indicia that you had this inner addict inside of you, like no, issues with alcohol or anything like that, which is like really interesting.
No, none whatsoever. I mean, listen, I partook. I mean, I went to college and I drank, and like I said, I smoked pot and had but I had a healthy, relationship with that stuff, and nothing nothing that would have indicated in any way that I should probably steer clear of any of this stuff. Until the Vicodin came into my life.
I was listening to your conversation with Dr. Drew the other day, and he was like befuddled and confused by this until you mentioned that you were Jewish.
Totally.
And it was like this light bulb goes off in him. Like he's searching for, like, he's trying to do the math in his head about how this works. And
that was a really interesting part. Really interesting part of that conversation was when he was trying to get to the bottom of it, and childhood trauma,
right.
and
dad an alcoholic.
Yeah, I was like, there's none of that. Yeah. And he's like, what, what's your ethnicity, or what's your sort of like, where, like, what's your makeup? And I was
Ashkenazi
like,
Jew.
oh, you're an Ashkenazi Jew. He's like, absolutely, there it is. And I was like, what? I nearly fell off my chair.
I'd never heard that before.
I'd never heard that either. And I have a huge amount of respect for Dr. Drew, but I in that moment, I was like, what?
I mean, basically, for people that are listening or watching, what he said was that there's something specific to Ashkenazi Jews that have like this, what did he say exactly? Something about like later in life addiction with opioids specifically, or something about that lineage of humanity that cottons onto that in a specific way.
That's correct. And that's precisely what he said. And now for all the Jewish moms that may be out there listening to this, don't lock your children up quite yet, but this is this belief that he has, and I can't speak to it, but because surely he knows what he's talking about, but I just can't speak to it. But light bulb went off, and so that was it for me. And so let's say that's true. Okay, these pills came into my life, and boom, here I am.
Right. And this quickly progresses. You get up to like 60 pills a day. And it becomes your primary occupation, trying to source and fill these scripts and make sure that your stash never runs out. Yeah. And it's like reading this and listening to you talk about it, I relate to that like obsession. But it also just reminds me how exhausting it is. It's like the amount of effort that went into making sure that you always had what you needed. I mean, it's not a preoccupation. It is the predominant thing that lives and breathes inside you 24 hours a day.
I had never worked harder at anything in my life before that point. I had never been as committed to anything in my life before that point. Maintaining a supply of these pills was really my only focus. And I had a big job at Details at this point, and family and friends and trying to like manage relationships and things like that. But this was really the only thing that I paid any true attention to, which is fascinating in and of itself, right? Because here I was running this magazine, but this was really all I cared about. And so when you get up to, as I did, 60 Vicodin a day, I ultimately switched over to another drug that where the numbers came down.
It's called Roxycodone.
Yeah, Roxycodone.
It's like twice the dosage.
It was twice the dosage, but without the Tylenol. So like I was taking extra strength Vicodin. I was essentially taking, let's say 60 a day. I would take, to break it down, I would take, and by the way, not immediately. I worked my way up to these numbers, right? So I didn't just dive in, be like, what, 60 seems like a good number. I ultimately got to 15 at a time, and I was doing it about 4 times a day. And so the active ingredients of an extra strength Vicodin are hydrocodone, which is the codeine based sort of analgesic painkiller,
the opiate part of it,
the opiate portion of it, and acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, right? And so I was taking, in addition to all of the opiates, I was essentially taking a small bottle of extra strength Tylenol a day.
Right.
For years.
Right. And we all know the dangers of acetaminophen, but that was another thing that Dr. Drew talked about, that he still doesn't see liver toxicity in people that are taking Vicodin at that dosage level, because the liver figures out a way to process all of this and keep you from dying.
Correct. And
it's amazing.
And when I got sober and went to my doctor, he was like, we need to take a look at your liver,
Right.
you know, like first and foremost, which was fine, you know. Yeah, the body has a way of a way of sort of like making it work for addicts, and the addiction is super crazy powerful. I'm of the belief that like it's quite possible that the addiction also just sort of finds a way to like keep allowing you to feed it, you know, and that may sound bizarre, but that's sort of like my view of it. But when you need that many pills, it's really hard to get them. And so it does take a lot of energy. And I put a ton of energy into it and was quite artful about it. You know, I think, you know, like addicts are brilliant liars.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Like
that was one thing Jeff said, ask Dan if he thinks he's the best liar in the world.
Right. We are masterful liars. And then certainly like you know, like the really close, like first cousin of that is great con artists, you know? And so I would go into these doctors' offices and I was doctor shopping. I was seeing probably 4 or 5 different doctors at a time and filling different prescriptions in different parts of town. And I would put on quite a performance for them on each visit. And over time, the performances became more and more elaborate because suspicions, you know,
elaborate or / comedic and transparent. I would imagine.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I suspect it was a different. I would imagine it's harder now because
I think
of
it is.
Everything that's happening and the crisis that, you know, our culture is weathering at the moment. But at the time, and this was another interesting thing that came up with you and Dr. Drew, this was the heyday of the pain management clinics and this idea that, you know, opioids were, you know, the solution and this white hat, you know, mentality and the litigious nature of our healthcare system such that, you know, no doctor wants to get sued
for
by
ignoring,
denying, saying, well, he was bullshitting me and then finding out he was wrong. So there was just an epidemic of oversubscription.
There was. And this is where I think like the conversation with Dr. Drew.
Well, let's get into it because I have thoughts on this too. And I have a sense of what you wanted to say and didn't say.
And it got interesting and it took an unexpected turn when Drew said to me.
He became an apologist for the pharmaceutical industry. In a certain way.
And maybe in a certain way he did. He was very dismissive of the complicity. Like, yes, what he said, and I was not stunned, but I was taken aback. And I don't want to misrepresent what he said.
And let me just say for the record too, like I've got crazy respect for Dr.
Yeah,
Drew.
he's
nothing but love for him.
Same.
Too.
But he put it all on the medical community, the doctors that were writing the prescriptions. And he was like, no, it's all the doctors, And again, I don't want to misrepresent him. Surely, you know, I think anyone knows that the pharmaceutical companies here were complicit also. But I was about to go down this road with him where I was going to say something to the effect of, listen, these pharmaceutical companies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing to do a number of different things, and I'm going to circle back to the point where you just were, but to do a number of different things. One of those things, I think, quite simply, was to falsely minimize the risk of addiction with respect to opiates. Right.
Right, and that's one thing Drew agreed with.
Right,
these people don't understand addiction.
Right, you know, but they have also spent hundreds of millions of dollars helping convince doctors that, and this is in my opinion, helping convince doctors that they were ignoring patients' pain and that there were broader uses for drugs like this and that pain is to be taken seriously. And this was the sort of like evil genius of these companies, you know, companies like Purdue and others that were, you know, teaching, quote unquote, teaching or educating doctors that you're ignoring patients' pain, that pain is real, and that you have to trust and believe patients when they come to you. And for a drug addict like me, and for a world-class liar like me, I was able to manipulate the shit out of that because I could go in a suit and tie, and I could go in limping and like my performance was fairly ornate.
Right. You're talking about like you would get out of the cab and limp into the doctor's office and limp out just in case a nurse happened to see you or whatever.
Right.
Like I would maintain the ruse.
I would limp down the street. I would start my performance a block or two away from the doctor's office in the event that someone that worked in that office may have been running out to grab a coffee or running an errand or something like that. I couldn't have them see me not in character. So it would start the second I climbed out of the subway or out of a taxi, and I would limp down the street, but I wouldn't just limp down the street. I would stop and like wince. I would lean against like a fire hydrant or whatever it was, and catch my breath. Like I really committed to this performance. But to go back to Dr. Drew, he said, yeah, no, it's all these doctors, all the doctors. I actually
pain management.
Pain management doctors, right? That and listen, it's surely he knows far more about this than I do. I know based on my experiences what happened to me, and I actually believe that these doctors were genuinely interested and genuinely, and deeply in some instances concerned about the symptoms that I was presenting. And I can't fault them for not calling bullshit on me. Like the performances were pretty Oscar worthy for a time. They really were. And so, but yeah, so here I am sitting talking to Drew, and we just we had this conversation, and I just was surprised that it went that way.
Well, certainly there is, an awareness level in the C-suite of these pharmaceutical companies that, look, they know they're selling an insane amount of these pills. These medications are going out. Like the level of, pain versus the prescription level, to anybody who would kind of, evaluate that spreadsheet would look out of whack, right? Like clearly people are abusing these drugs.
Well, not only that, but they quite successfully managed to convince doctors that if a kid, some college baseball player breaks his arm, oh, this is good for that too. Like initially, these drugs were most frequently prescribed for end of life care, cancer patients in just like excruciating, agonizing pain, victims of accidents and things like that, and the people in these C-suites at these pharmaceutical companies, I think, seized on an opportunity to say, okay, hey, listen, there's more market here for us, because there are lots of people that are having teeth pulled and breaking bones and injuring themselves by doing cartwheels and things like that we should be tapping into.
What's interesting about your case is that you would think that somebody of your kind of privilege and stature, you hear these stories, I don't know whether they're apocryphal or not, of, people who are, have that kind of level of access, have their special doctor who's, ethically compromised, who's just more than willing to, write all kinds of crazy scripts for, cash under the table. But you're playing this shell game with, these doctors that are, not those people, right? Like you're just trying to get these scripts written.
I am
board
I am
as much as possible,
because that was the, at least initially, that's what I was doing. But I was always always felt like a pretender. I was always pretending. And the magic, the idea of like creating an illusion, the idea of deception is something that I can now, all these years later, look back and say, oh, like my love and interest in magic and card tricks and coin tricks and all those magic books that I poured over and all those, videotapes that I bought and like basically wore out the VCR playing and watching, learning and studying magic. Really,
this is your ultimate opportunity to deploy all of that.
This was the grand
this master
illusion.
Charade.
It really was. And,
Wow.
and I owned it. And worked to perfect it. I would go into these pain management specialists' offices, and I would walk into the waiting room, and I would see the pain patients, the real pain patients, sitting there. People like with just no color in their faces, people that took all the energy that they probably could muster just to like get from home to the doctor's office and I would look at their expressions or the way they walked or the way that they would like lower themselves into the chair in the waiting room. And I would sponge off of that. I would make my shtick better from watching these people, you know,
like a method acting approach.
Totally.
My favorite of all your ruses was when you would create these elaborate overseas itineraries.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to be in Australia for 30 days, and you would reserve airline tickets and print out. You'd have your assistant print out itineraries.
I would
bring these in.
I would show up at the pharmacist with my passport in hand. So I would, I was running out. I was running out of pills, and I was running out of doctors to get pills from.
When you're taking 60 a day, you're always running out.
You're right. You're right. And so it was a constant search for pills. It's all I cared about. And so I would start going back to doctors that had prescribed me, 300 pills. Two weeks ago, I would go back to them after 2 weeks when they wrote me a prescription for a month, and I would start having to get creative in that respect also. You can't go into these doctors and say, I lost my pills.
Yeah.
That's just like that they weren't gonna swallow, but I would go in and I would use my job at Details Magazine to sort of help legitimize this. And I would say, hey, it's the worst possible timing, but I'm going off on like a world tour and I would make up just ridiculous shit. Oh, I'm going to a textile mill in Italy to see how, cashmere is made. And then right from there, I'm going to this leather moccasin factory to see how they're hand sewn. And then I'm going over to Australia to do this. And here I've brought the itinerary, and I would have, in anticipation of this meeting, my assistant at the magazine make up a travel itinerary. And I would just say, hey, can you put together a travel itinerary, start me in Milan, then take me to Sicily, and then from Sicily to Rome, and then from Rome to Sydney. And my assistant would look at me like, what on earth? I'm like, I'm just curious, I doubt I'm going to do this trip, but just go ahead and call the travel agent and put together the itinerary and let's price it out. And then she would print out an itinerary for me, and I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, let's not go ahead and book it. But I would have this sheet in my hand, and I would go see the doctors one after the next, and it would be like the same thing, like, listen, my back's been killing me, so it's the worst possible timing, but I just need to do this. Maybe I should even probably just quit my job because, it's sort of untenable. And I'm thinking about, and I would just go into this, I would go off on this improv routine and limping and clutching and wincing and groaning in pain where I felt no pain, by the way, and
there's no physical outward indicia that you're loaded. Are your pupils pinned? Are you clammy?
No, because or at least not that I was aware of, and nothing. There were no obvious tells, and I wouldn't go into these doctors' offices loaded up and high. You know, I was able to sort of be, I would try to be anyway, smart about the timing of what I refer to in the book as my feedings. Taking pills were my feedings, and I was feeding this beast of this addiction. And so I would time my feedings around, you know, what I deemed to be important meetings, not just meetings with doctors, but meetings with my boss, or even a phone call with my mom, or whatever the case was, you know, because more and more people were starting to look at me a little strangely and starting to ask, hey, like, what's wrong with you? You know,
Right.
like that was like a refrain for me from these years. Like, hey, what's wrong with you? We're like, that's not normal. You know, like those two things, hearing the word normal, like is still like a trigger for me, you know, because I wasn't normal, you know? But yeah, I would go to great lengths to convince these doctors that I was like legitimately in need of a new prescription.
And just keeping track of when you talked to that doctor the last time, and you know how much time it allowed, like keeping all your stories
That
straight.
was
like,
actually
it's
quite
like,
simple, but like thanks to
like
pill,
a spreadsheet or
no,
something.
the pill bottles had
it would
labels
have
with
the
dates
dates.
on them, and I could say, oh, okay, I got this filled. Which means I saw the doctor that same day, because I didn't sit on prescriptions. You know, I would get them filled immediately, and I would start to, I would use those as like my roadmap, basically.
Until then you have this the pink you know, bathrobe thing situation.
The visits to the doctor's office just weren't enough. They really weren't. When this and let me say also that like I can sort of talk about this now with some measure of excitement or even like humor, you know, but this is a dark and awful place to be. I mean, it really is. And anyone that has struggled with or is actively, dealing with this addiction, or has someone in their life that is actively dealing with this addiction. And let's be honest, like, and
A lot of people.
that's a lot of people, right? This touches a lot of people. You don't have to go too far, you know, in your kind of world, in your own orbit, to find someone that is dealing with this in some way. But then, you know, as I wrote this book, I had a little bit of distance from it. I was able to look back on some of these experiences and find also some moments of levity there. The moment of this pink gown was a really interesting time, because I would run out of doctors that I could call, because you start to know who's going to give them up and who's not, you know? And
I got one more with this guy, and then he's going to be done with me.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like I can probably, right, I'm going to try this guy, but they're probably not going to give me an appointment, or they'll take care of me one more time, and then I'm like dead to them, you know? And, you know, because they would say, okay, I'll give you these pills, but, you know, I really think you need to start physical therapy, or I want to start doing certain like nerve block injections. Like I didn't want any of that shit. I just wanted the pills. So I needed to start to find different ways to get them. And sometimes when I was really bad, because let's just take a second and talk about what happens when you stop taking the pills.
Yeah.
So when you run out, it is absolutely brutal is the perfect word. It's brutal. You know, it's hell on earth. And the acute physical symptoms of opiate withdrawal are such that your body, you know, because your body needs them. Your body is craving them. Your brain has gotten accustomed to having this chemical there, and your body just absolutely starts to demand them when you run out of them. And so and it lets you know that it's not happy, and
Loud and clear.
like in an unmistakable way. And so you start to feel run down, you start to have hot flashes, you start sweating, and then all of a sudden you're freezing. You can get headaches, there's nausea and diarrhea, and
Your brain doesn't work either. You can't basically,
focus.
Create a cohesive thought.
You can't. And it's just absolutely miserable. And any depiction of opiate withdrawal, which includes heroin, that you've seen in a movie is very accurate. It's you're shivering, you're shaking, you're miserable, your whole body aches, you can't think, you can't focus. And it doesn't just come and go. It sticks with you. And so I would run out of pills all the time, and I would go through withdrawal all the time. And I would go to the emergency room that was near where I lived in New York City at the time, St. Vincent's. It's no longer there. It's now like ridiculously priced condos. But I would go to the emergency room and I would walk in and so the first time I went, I had been at an event that evening, a gala where I was wearing a tuxedo, and the symptoms of withdrawal were kicking in while I was at this gala. And I eventually left and went home, peeled off my tuxedo, and just basically got into bed and like waited for this to happen, which was just awful. The anxiety, the fear of it coming was equally as powerful as the actual withdrawal, symptoms itself, just this sort of buildup of anxiety and terror, Right. I mean, I describe it in the book as like a scene from a horror movie where like you're hiding and like this sort of killer is like, the killer's in the room, right? And you're under the bed or you're in the closet and you see feet walk by or like a shadow or silhouette of something, and you just know it's about to come, and it does, and like you get yanked out from underneath the bed, or the closet door flies open and like you're toast. And that's what I felt, this like deep panic of like, oh my God, it's coming, it's going to be unrelenting. It's just awful. So, this night of this gala, I was like, screw this, I'm going to go to the emergency room. And I actually, at like 2 or 3 in the morning, put the tuxedo back on and went into an emergency room because I felt that I wouldn't present as just like a junkie, looking like truly like itching, like quite literally for a fix if I had this tuxedo on, and that like somehow, this would make my experience there easier. I walk into the emergency room and the triage nurse is just sort of like, they've seen it all, like a New York City emergency room at like 3 in the morning. But I managed to kind of get in, and I was in this sort of part of the emergency room, and they had given me this blue gown, this blue paper gown to put on, and I put my tuxedo in a bag that they had given me to hold my stuff. And I'm sitting across from this woman, pretty much the same distance that I am from you now, so just a few feet. And she was in a pink paper gown to my blue paper gown, and we were in an incredibly well lit room. And she was there was a stack. She was next to the counter that had a sink and a stack of individually wrapped alcohol wipes and probably some cotton balls and tongue depressors and like that knee hammer. And she was staring at me, and she was naked under her gown. And I know this because she was sort of exposing herself to me. And she was taking one at a time, these alcohol wipes. She would tear them open, take one out, wipe it all over her face, drop it to the floor, take another one, while keeping eye contact with me. It was fascinating. And I eventually get led out of that room and in to see a doctor. And part of my whole shtick when I was talking to doctors was to appear as normal as possible. And part of my whole shtick in life, as we talked about with me getting dropped into the world of journalism, of fashion journalism, was engaging with people immediately, And so I would engage this doctor. I did in this instance in the emergency room, talking to this doctor. It's the middle of the night. He's got to be exhausted. And I'm like, wow, it's like the Star Wars cantina out there in the waiting room. It's
you
like,
and I, we're fine.
Yeah, like thankfully I can connect with like a normal person because, it's pretty weird out there, man. And I'm talking to him, and I start telling him about this woman that I was sitting across from, who was exposing herself to me and wiping these alcohol swabs all over her face. And he said to me, really without even kind of looking up, like, what color gown was she wearing? Was it pink? And I was like, how do you know that? And he's like, well, we give the people that we have psychiatric concerns about pink gowns so that everyone knows that when they see someone in a pink gown, keep your eye on them and make sure that they aren't a risk to themselves or other patients, or don't like just sort of behave in a way that would generally be described as crazy. And I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I get a prescription from this guy. I go about my business. Not 4 or 5 months later, I'm back in the emergency room. I'm not wearing a tuxedo this time, and the symptoms of withdrawal are particularly powerful. And had taken some other things to try to help tamp them down, Valium and things like that. And it was the middle of the night, and I was found my way to the hospital. I just was desperate. I just couldn't go through withdrawal, yet again. And I go up to the window, the triage nurse, and I explain, tried to sort of stay true to my script, but must have delivered a subpar performance, because she was like, it's going to be a few minutes. And I eventually get led into a room, and there's like an intake nurse taking my blood pressure and things like that. And I'm sweating, and I think my voice was probably quivering, but I'm still trying to stay to my sort of spiel. And I'm like, how long will this be? Because I have early meetings tomorrow. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I'm the editor-in-chief of Details magazine. That's a major national magazine, by the way. And I have lots of important things in front of me. And this is just like a burden for me. And she's like, look, you're going to be here definitely for a little while, so why don't you go ahead and change out of your clothes and put this on? And she handed me a pink paper gown.
Yeah.
But here's the thing.
Did you bust a move out of there?
I sure did.
Yeah.
I got right out of there.
You're one step away from getting locked up at that point.
I got right out of there. My story has lots of moments like that, though. Yeah. There were.
It is funny, but it is, it's sad and it's pathetic, and it's, it just speaks to the places that something like this will take you to.
It does. It speaks to the depths that this will take you. And for me, I've been asked as I'm sort of now out and about talking about my book, like, hey man, like what's your bottom? And that's a question that people in recovery will ask other people in recovery. And that's a question that people want to know, like, man, what was your breaking point? Like what got you to sobriety? And it is most often a bottom of some kind. I lost my job. I had a horrible car accident, nearly killed someone, did kill someone, like awful, horrible things that happen when people, abuse alcohol and drugs. I didn't have one bottom. I feel like I just had like a series of
progressively demoralizing situations.
Correct.
Stacked up.
That just stacked up, and this was just one of them, But I think my point is that I would wake up the next day after having like what should have been a moment of clarity, like, hey man, wow, like this is getting really bad. And people are starting to be on to you here, and or like you're gonna die, and I would say that to myself all the time. Like I got to a point where I was at nighttime were like my biggest highs. I would take the most pills at night because I
the big feeding.
The big feeding, exactly. Yeah. I could really just kind of zonk myself out, and I would take 15 pills, let's say, and then be like, I'm going to add like a couple more on top of that just to like really numb myself out. But this might kill me, but I would take them anyway. And it's not that I wanted to die, because I don't think I wanted to die. I was prepared to die though for that high.
Right.
It was just something I was prepared to do. And but I would wake up the next morning from these moments and I would start all over again. I wasn't, and this is the thing, and there are probably a lot of people in recovery that will be like, like you're not ready until you're ready.
Yeah.
You know, and it's hard to
And even when you think you're ready, you may still not be ready. I mean, you have this story about you go through the full detox at your mom's, right? And then basically shortly thereafter, cop right away.
I do.
And not planning to, but that's the way it works. Right?
Yes, that for me that was right, and it's a really powerful addiction, right? So I went down to my mom's house in Baltimore, and what did it for me ultimately, I was ready, I just couldn't stop. I absolutely couldn't stop. You know, I knew I needed to stop. I acknowledged that I was a drug addict. I knew that I was going to probably die if I didn't stop. I had been ODing, so had stopped breathing a number of times in the middle of the night. I write about in the book of a girlfriend like waking up literally with someone like a girlfriend on top of me, like basically banging on my chest, like freaking out because I wasn't breathing. Later, when I was married, my wife would say, you know, in the morning, like, wow, you were like gasping for air in the middle of the night, you know, almost like you're holding your breath. Like, you know, what's going on, you know? And I'd be like, I don't know, maybe it's sleep apnea or something like that.
It's crazy how long you got away with it in your marriage.
It's extraordinary how long I got away with it in my marriage. And it's also, you know, if we're being really honest, you know, it's extraordinary what I put her through.
Yeah.
And I
because you're never really present, and there's no true intimacy as long as, you know, that exists between you. That's
correct. There's like a wall in between us, and there was something that was more important. There was something I loved more, you know, and that was these drugs. And it's hard for me to say this now. Like I feel it. Like I feel like, you know, like emotions stirring up around this, you know, but that's just the truth. Yeah. Like I wasn't present for anyone or anything in my life other than this addiction. It was the only thing that I cared about, and feeding it. And so the people that are around addicts, the people that are in the lives of addicts, certainly moms and dads and siblings, but also spouses and partners and colleagues, all of those things really are just victims of this addiction also. They suffer tremendously at the hands of this addiction also.
Yeah, and the addict is blind to that until it's way too late.
Absolutely. The addict does not see it. Worse, the addict will try to turn it and gaslight, and will try to,
of course, because you've got to protect that above everything else.
Exactly. So I would try to make anyone that like would start to question my behavior, I would do everything in my power to make it seem like, like you owe me an apology for suggesting that, like what's wrong with you, or why are you being paranoid, or whatever it is, you know?
And the great lie, of course, I mean, during the romance period, there's this sense that you're hyper productive and you're able to like, you know, perform at a higher level, and like, this is what I need in order to do this crazy job that I have.
Right.
And it's only over time that you realize that that's all a lie.
That's all bullshit.
And there is a little bit of a narrative out there around your story in your book that you were this high functioning addict. And I guess, you know, I
don't believe that
I understand
to be true.
that, but like, yeah, it's not true.
I don't believe that to be true.
You become this absentee editor. You're like working from home, or you're coming up with reasons not to come into the office. Shit's going haywire. There's, you know, crises that are happening that are widely publicized about things that are happening at the magazine. And this, you know, sense that you become this very mercurial person, right? Who's prone to these outbursts and unpredictable and
But it was more of an air of mystery than anything else. But I think that's an amazing point. I'm really glad you brought that up. It's actually a really sort of like astute point to make. Like I wasn't high functioning. And that is part of this sort of thing that's out there now about this book, that I was this high functioning addict. I wasn't. I was an addict hiding in plain sight. And there are a lot of addicts hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. It's like, what was that story in the New York Times about the Silicon Valley executive and the wife who didn't know, and she found him dead. Like, I think they were divorced, but then she found him dead in his place and all the vials everywhere.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah. And I know her and Eileen, and she's She's written a terrific
Right.
book, and about her experience.
Oh, is Smash?
Smacked.
Smacked, right? Yeah.
And or at least I'm pretty sure. And look, I wasn't high functioning. I may have appeared to be, and I didn't try to portray it that way in the book. In fact, I think I portray it quite honestly.
But I think just people in a perfunctory way are like, oh, he was able to hold this job for 7 years or whatever, while under the influence. So
and I was, and so that you're right. That leads people to then say you must have been a high functioning addict. I wasn't. I was an absentee editor. I was plugged in, when I needed to be. And was there at the ideation stage of things, because that was always my strength, finding the story. What's the way in here? What's the best way for us to tell this story? Even high, I was able to do that, but I was not there in any meaningful way. And had it not been for an extraordinary team of editors and writers and everyone that's around helping to sort of produce a magazine, it wouldn't have gotten published.
Right. The other narrative that's emerged from your book, which I imagine is probably comes as somewhat of a surprise to you, is that now it's become this referendum on corporate responsibility and what actually was going on at Condé Nast during this time.
Yes, and I don't care for that narrative too much. I'm not paying that much attention to it, but I know that it's there, and I think. Listen, people are entitled to have whatever reaction they want to the book. I think what I'm learning is that there are certain media people that their reaction is, and then I want to circle back to getting sober at my mom's if we can.
Yeah, of course.
But there are people that are looking at it and being like, where was the oversight and where was the management of this person, meaning me, and how could they not know, meaning the corporation, and oh my God, editors were traveling like that and flying first class and all of that, and shame on him for, someone else could have been doing this job. And I didn't write the book for media people.
No, you're right. You're just telling your story.
I'm telling
That's
my
why,
story.
Obviously, this is like a surprising byproduct.
It is, and it's an annoying one, but I'm working through it. But it's to me, Details Magazine, Condé Nast, the publishing company that put Details Magazine out, media in general, are really just characters in my book to help contextualialize my story and my
most
addiction.
of whom you anonymize anyway.
Most of whom, exactly. I changed the names of just about of as many people as I possibly could, just to avoid dragging people into my mess.
Yeah, it's not intended to be an expose of anyone
absolutely
other than
not.
yourself.
Absolutely not. And so, but there are people that are sort of like kind of taking me to task, or the media or Condé Nast to task, and so be it. I mean, it is what it is. Just with respect to oversight, though, like I think the magazine was doing well. This was the thing, and maybe this.
And if it's doing well, they're leaving you alone.
They were leaving me alone.
It was a time of crazy expense accounts, and you're like, and it's living in a hotel basically, right? And taking town cars everywhere. And,
this was that world
at
the time, and no one was paying attention if.
It was going well.
You were hitting your goals and or exceeding them even, and we were doing really nicely, and so no one was going to sort of jump in and be like, hey, what's going on here? There was no reason to, and I had a ton of autonomy, and that's that, and incidentally, it's sort of, I wouldn't blame or hold anyone accountable for lack of oversight anyway, like I was making choices and then obviously became a full-blown addict, when I ultimately got sober, I so this all circles back to my then wife, who was pregnant, at the time with our oldest son, and she ultimately did discover that I was taking all of these pills, and I think did an incredibly brave thing, which I'm grateful for every day, which was like, hey, like, I love you, but you need to get out of this house and you need to deal with this. But you can't do it here. I'm 6 months pregnant. I can't have it around me. And I am really grateful for that, and I respect that, and I think it was a really smart thing for her to do. And I went down to my mom's house and got sober, spent 2 weeks down there. And,
I'm home, Mom.
Yeah, like here I am. There's nothing quite like being like a 35-year-old man or person and going back to your mom's house and basically just sort of like crumbling to pieces, which is precisely what happened. And I got sober. I was down there for 2 weeks. I attended my first 12-step meeting. I called the doctors. Someone in my life in my childhood that I grew up with, who was sober, said, "Hey, you need to tell on yourself. You need to call these doctors." And I was like, "Yes," like I was in it. I was like, "This is the new me." And
cut off the source.
And I'm going to cut it off at the source, And I started called. I was probably seeing 3 or 4 doctors at the time, and I called all of them except for one. So
the stash. Even
in that moment of feeling amazing about where I had, where I was, how I was starting to feel, being like, oh wow, like I'm through the physical stuff, I held back and had to re-engage with my life in New York. I had a big job that I was away from for 2 weeks. I had a pregnant wife that I needed to figure out like a path forward with. And after all the sort of crap that I had put her through. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go back to New York. I had been enrolled in an outpatient recovery facility in New York City to go to meetings, probably every day or 4 times a week. And on the way back, I'm on a train. I'll get on that Amtrak train and from Baltimore to New York, and I call and I get a prescription, and it's waiting for me at a pharmacy. And I get off the train. I go right to the pills, and I took them for a day.
Cunning, baffling, and powerful.
The most cunning, baffling, and powerful. And it isn't such a powerful disease, addiction is, that even while I was in Baltimore, I made this split-second decision while I was calling these doctors to hold back.
Hold one back.
To hold one back.
Have that out.
That's how powerful it is. I'd gone through so much. I was out to everything. My wife had kicked me out. My pregnant wife had kicked me out. All of this stuff, it didn't matter. I made the decision in a blink of an eye to do that. And I went back to New York, and I took pills for a day, and then I stopped.
That was it.
That was October 12th, 2007.
And your son was born shortly thereafter, right?
He was born in January of 2008, just 3 short months from the time that I got sober.
Yeah, that idea of like, what's your bottom? I mean, the demoralization of filling that script and taking those pills after that commitment that you made to yourself. I mean, they always say like, if you want to like really ruin your drinking and using, like get a head full of AA and then use, and it's just like you've never felt worse and more ashamed of yourself when you do that.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah,
right, because it hopefully gets you to come back, and in this case for me anyway, it did, but.
2007, sober ever since.
Ever since.
13 years.
It's October. Yeah. So in October of 20, it'll be 13 years. So I celebrated 12.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It has changed my life with the same degree, same sort of force that Cartwheel did. Because I live in gratitude now, and I'm really grateful to be here because I shouldn't be. And, this opiate addiction kills 130 people a day. There are 130 opiate related overdose deaths every day. And I'm a miracle, and I know that. And, I try to be grateful for it every day. I try to do a gratitude list actually every day. I have this email chain that I'm on with about 10 other guys, and we just hit reply all and list the things that I'm grateful for,
Cool.
you know, and I'm super grateful for so many basic things that I used to take for granted, or I used to see normal, quote unquote, normal people do all the time. Basic stuff like take the trash out and open the mail and pay bills and shave, things like that, you know, that I just never did. You know, I never made them a priority. They were burdensome things to do, these simple things, these small little things. And now I'm sober 12 plus years, and I kid you not, I still, when I take the garbage out, when I open my mail, when I shave, which I do almost every day, I'm still incredibly grateful for the fact that I'm doing those things. And I, in my mind, celebrate them ever so briefly as small victories. They are wins for me because I shouldn't be here to do any of these things. And shaving is one that is particularly meaningful to me because I had gotten to a point as an active addict where I didn't want to shave because I couldn't stand to stand in front of a mirror and see myself, which you have to do in order to shave your face. And I just couldn't look at myself. I felt such shame. I was defeated. And so now I shave every day and I feel really good about it.
Yeah. That's beautiful, man.
You know, it's true.
I think one of my favorite things about your story and something that I relate to is your embrace of the traditional path of 12-step and how much you appreciate, you know, what the program has offered you and how it's changed your life and how you've been able to maintain your involvement in the program at a very immersive, you know, highest priority level. And I suspect that if you were still editing Details magazine, there would be articles in the magazine about, you know, ayahuasca and, you know, new protocols and treatments for addiction, and everything we thought we knew about addiction is wrong. And look, I'm somebody who got sober in a treatment center and, you know, showed up at AA in Los Angeles and just basically went in full bore, you know, and it's still, you know, the most important thing in my life. And it's just interesting to over the years, like, you know, I got sober in 98, like to see these trends kind of come and go and, you know, how people respond to, you know, what worked for me and, you know, are always kind of coming up with new and different ways. And it's like, all I know, man, is that like AA works.
Right.
It's been a miracle in my life. Like, you know, the arc of my life is absurd. And I am privileged to be able to sit across with and participate in a community of people where I see broken people come in and they are welcomed and embraced and loved and cared for in the most selfless way. And I've seen lives change in the most dramatic ways possible. And like, that's my experience. I don't know what else to tell you, man. You know what I mean?
And again, you can only share your experience, right? I can't say, hey, this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do it, because I actually don't believe that there is a right way and a wrong way.
Yeah, and I don't have an opinion. I have friends that have gotten sober in different ways too, and that's fine.
And that's awesome.
You know?
That's amazing. There are lots of different paths to recovery. All I can say is that for me, the 12-step program and specifically AA is what does it for me. And making meetings a priority in my life is incredibly important to me because, and I do it still to this day. You know, I try to get to 2 or 3 meetings a week, you know, if I can, and sometimes more if I have the ability to do more. It's incredibly, incredibly important for me because I like the way that I approach my life now. And I am far from perfect. God knows I'm far from perfect, but I am present. I try to stay healthy. I try to be accountable for my shit, for my actions, for my behavior. These are things that I was a blamer. You know, I would point the finger at anyone and everyone. Now I take stock in what I've done to contribute to kind of where I am or if some situation or argument or whatever the case may be. And for me, that's been with the help and support of the 12-step program and the fellowship of men and women who are in the 12-step program. And so, like I said, there's no one path, but this has been my path, and it's been pretty stellar. You know, I mean, it really has.
How do you think about the tradition of anonymity now, being somebody who's written a book about this and is somebody who, you know, is of the media?
I have my thoughts on this are actually sort of evolving as we speak. I believe in anonymity. I think it's a very individual. I think it's a big decision if you choose to break your anonymity and speak openly about your recovery. I think that we live in a culture that I think the stigma is real. And I think it's important for me to say that. And I'm hoping, as are others who speak publicly about their addiction and alcoholism, to destigmatize this. And we know that this isn't a moral failure. This is a condition. This is part of the human condition. This is a disease. And I think it's been categorized as such, you know, by the American Medical Association. This is a real thing. This isn't a lack of willpower. This isn't someone that just can't get it together, man. Come on. Like, it isn't, though. It's not that. And so lots of people have come out and disclosed that they're addicts or alcoholics. And I think, and I'm happy to have done it. And I'm happy to have written this book and share my story in an effort to show people that either are struggling with this or it's touching their lives in some way, that there is hope. Because I truly believe, and we hear a lot of people say this, if I can do it, meaning find sobriety, anyone can. That said, I think the stigma is real. And I think that there are people out there that are like, will publicly be like, oh man, awesome, you wrote this book, that's super brave, and I know this is going to help a lot of people, you know, but I think privately are judging. I really do believe that. Not everyone, of course, you know, but I think that this is going to be a tough nut to crack, you know, I really do. And again, I'm sharing my story to help crack that nut, if you will, you know, but I think in 2020, like, the stigma is real, you know, and I encourage people to ask for help, you know, and I was terrified to ask for help. I didn't want to lose this plum job that I had, which, by the way, I kept for an additional 8 years after I got sober.
Right.
But I was terrified I was going to lose that. I didn't want to lose my marriage, you know, and I ultimately ended up getting divorced. But in that moment, I was about to be a dad. I didn't want to lose that. And I didn't want people to judge me. I didn't want people to go, oh my God, he's an addict. And I think that there's a lot of that. So I'm sharing my story to, and as have others, of course, to work toward destigmatizing this addiction.
What is your sense of what can be done about the opioid crisis? I mean, it's dark.
It is dark, and it is devastating whole communities in this country, and it's really sweeping across our country in an incredibly powerful way. I think we need to talk about it. And I think we have to be careful also, right? We're in an election cycle. So we hear it come up at debates and we hear, yes, we're going to fight this opioid epidemic. And yes, we're going to crush it. And we're hard at work on it. And that to some degree may be true. And I think it's nice that it's being mentioned. I think it's important that it's being mentioned. But I think in order to really see an impact, to make an impact here, we have to do a number of things. I think we need to focus on prevention. I think we need to focus on education. I think we need to focus on treatment. I think we need to, as you pointed out, had the luxury and the privilege. Have had a privileged life, and I know that, and I don't make excuses for that. But I understand that. I'm really aware of that. And I'm aware of the fact that even getting sober, I had a family, a mom and a family, a mom and a dad and a brother and a stepfather and all these people that opened their arms and brought me home.
Including David Copperfield, which we didn't talk about.
Including the magician David Copperfield. Who
that's a high privilege. Yeah, David Copperfield, come and stay at my place.
Factors heavily into my story. I had that. I had the ability to go to an outpatient program. So with respect to treatment, I really believe that it can't be easier to get the drug than it is to get the treatment. And in huge portions of this country, that's precisely the case. It's just so much easier to find more drugs than it is to find treatment. And so there need to be strong treatment options across this country, even if it's peer-based treatment, 12-step, whatever the case may be, where people can go to get help and don't have to spend and don't have to do anything. I had the luxury of being able to do that. There are people that go off to incredibly expensive rehabs and they can afford to do that or have insurance that covers that, and that's wonderful. And I encourage you to do that if you have the resources to do that. But creating treatment options that are available to everyone that is impacted by this in this country, because this opioid epidemic is impacting everyone. It doesn't discriminate, right? It's the great equalizer, man. I was a New York City media executive, grossly overpaid. I had a great life. That didn't matter. It's impacting absolutely everyone. And there are those that need treatment options that don't get them. So I think that's really important. And I think, federal appropriations need to sort of be earmarked for that. And they need to be long-term, not like, we're going to throw a couple years worth of funding here and see where things go. And we're going to, I think this is real, and it is incredibly, incredibly hard to stop.
Yeah, I think one of the things Dr. Drew said in your conversation was we need to make treatment as available as the drugs themselves, right? Like it needs to be freely available and accessible. I mean, out here in Malibu, I think Malibu has the highest percentage of like halfway houses and rehabs of anywhere in the country. But so many of them are real estate plays. Like they get these fancy houses and they know that they can rent these rooms out at an insane price. And it just becomes these profit centers that really aren't rooted in, the proper motivation to help people that can't afford this kind of thing.
Or on top of that are at times staffed by people that aren't as qualified as they need to be to offer that help.
Yeah, 100%. What is your daily you talked about your gratitude list and going to a couple meetings a week, but like, what is the daily practice for you?
So the daily practice for me starts with gratitude. Like I said, I think, I am grateful for every day that I have, because I really don't think that I should still be here. And so I take a minute and take stock of that, or at least try to every day. I'm working toward, I almost just told you a lie. I was like, I meditate every day. No, I don't.
But just right there, like that instance of you almost saying something and catching yourself, like that's sobriety.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, calling myself out on my own bullshit, right? Yeah. To thine own self be true. Like it absolutely must start with being honest with yourself. Right. And that to me is everything, like, am I being a good human today? Like, am I engaging in meaningful ways with people? And am I apologizing if I owe someone an apology? Am I judging someone when I shouldn't be judging them? Because Jesus, the Lord knows, like, who am I to judge, right? So it's just sort of like keeping myself in check. So right, I don't meditate every day. I don't come close to meditating every day, but I am trying to bring meditation into my life more and more, because it is like a game changer when I'm able to do it, So gratitude, meditation. I try to take some time to have like a strong spiritual connection and just sort of acknowledge that like I'm here for a reason. I try to be super present now. I was never present. I lived a life of not showing up in any way, emotionally, like physically. I just was never there. And so I try to be present in every way that I possibly can today, and show up for people when I say I'm going to show up for them. You know, addiction is lonely and terrifying at times, and so if I can be present for people, if I can be present for myself, and more than anything else, I'm present for my kids. Man, I'm a sober dad, right?
And you have 3 kids, right?
I have 3 sons, and they've only ever known me as a sober man, and that is like the greatest gift of sobriety for me. And I work to earn that and deserve that every day. Being a dad is why I believe I was given a second. Excuse me, it's hard for me. I can't even get emotional. Is why I believe I'm here. And so I try to be super, super present for them. I try to eat healthy when I can, you know? I mean, I sort of like don't want to open that can of worms with you.
Your diet during the heavy pill popping phase is insane.
Yeah, it was really out of control, and it was really unhealthy, and could have killed me just as quickly as the addiction could have. I was eating
microwaving Ben and Jerry's ice cream
and just chugging it right from the container, you know. So you know, I try to be healthy, man, and I try to stay small. You know, I try to live like be really good with living like a good small life, you know. A friend of mine, Laura McCowan, has recently written a memoir called "We Are the Luckiest," and there's a chapter in there where she talks about sitting down with someone else in recovery who'd been an old timer, you know, and she was new and fucking miserable and missing her old life, and she sits down at this restaurant with this person and says like, what's your life like today? And I mean, I'm completely bastardizing her this chapter in her book, and this woman says, I have a nice little life. And at first Laura's like, who wants that? Right. You know, I have a nice little life now. Yeah. And I'm, you know, so thank you for that, Laura. And I'm, you know, I'm good.
Beautiful. In writing the book, who were like, you know, there's a whole genre of, you know, addiction yarns out there, like some good, some not so good. Like I would imagine like Burroughs.
You know, well, I will say when I was writing the book, I stayed away from them because I didn't want to
be overly influenced
in any way, be influenced by what I was reading. And so I purposely kept away from them. That said, there are people that have written, I think, quite beautifully about addiction and about recovery. And certainly Augustine Burroughs is one of those people. I think Augustine has done it also with great humor, which I think is important. But there's so many great works out there. David Carr, I think did it masterfully. And there are others. Mary Carr. There are many others.
And what was the motivation in writing this book now? I mean, you've been sober for a while at this point. Like, how did this come about?
I had heard of all of the vast riches that befall authors.
The ultimate get-rich-quick scheme.
Exactly. I felt like I had stories to share. If for no other reason, I wanted to just put them down on paper to share with my kids one day. I started writing them, and it turned into a book. I think it's really important for people to just know that there's a path out, and because when I was actively using, I would look at these books and I would hear stories. I remember really quite vividly being an active addict and like just being zonked out on pills and like sitting on my sofa with probably like a cigarette like burning down to my knuckles, you know, and you know, empty, you know, Ben and Jerry's containers, you know, around me. Like it wasn't pretty. And watching like on some entertainment TV show, Entertainment Tonight or something like that, like this celebrity, like going into rehab, you know, and I remember 30 days later, sitting on that sofa, I had moved, but it would look like I hadn't. And seeing the report, so-and-so out of rehab and, you know, openly, publicly addressing for the first time, you know, their new recovery and thinking, oh my God, like I could have done it in these 30
in
days.
that period of time where you hadn't moved.
I could have done it, and I would feel worse and worse about myself, you know, because I wanted to stop. I was ready. I really was desperate to stop. So my point is, I think people sharing their stories helps. It didn't help get me off that couch. It didn't help me stop me from going to getting the next series of prescriptions. But the seed was planted.
It was a domino in that process.
It was.
Right?
And so if my book can be that for someone, I think that that's important. I also think that it's important for people that don't know addiction, that haven't lived with it or been exposed to it through a family member or loved one, just to see a glimpse into what it looks like. And so that was part of the motivating factor also. It was like, hey, take a look at how awful this can get and try to understand that this is really all consuming. And this book will give you a glimpse of that.
Well, with 130 people dying every single day from this very condition, none of us are more than one or two people away from somebody who is currently suffering from this. So the time, you know, is now for this conversation more than ever. And the need for solutions, you know, begins with understanding. And understanding means, you know, wrapping your head around the experience of what it is like to endure something like this. So I applaud you for writing the book. And I think the best way to land this plane is to have you kind of speak to the addict who perhaps is listening right now, that person who might be on the couch, you know, with some Ben and Jerry's containers listening to this, but unsure about what that first step looks like.
I think that first step looks like acknowledging that you are an addict. And for me, I struggled with that for a long time. And then I eventually acknowledged that I was an addict while I was still using. And I used for a while longer after that. But to acknowledge, I mean, to really simplify it, to acknowledge a powerlessness over this addiction. There's nothing that it's not going to go away on its own. And you need to step up and say, okay, I'm ready. You have to be ready, and you have to step forward and say, I'm ready. And I think that's the most important first step, is to acknowledge it and to reach out and ask for help. You don't have to do it publicly. You don't have to tweet about it or post about it, but you should reach out and ask for help, because you cannot do it alone. It is incredibly difficult to do it alone. And I tried.
Everybody tries first.
Yeah.
They gotta try it until they realize it's not going to work.
It's not going to work. Yeah. So my advice to that person would be, okay, let's own this. Like, this is where you are, and let's ask for help, because help is there. And I was welcomed into a community of people, into the recovery community, in ways that I never ever thought would have been possible.
And just the pure realization that your situation is not unique, right? Like, there's this idea like that whatever you're enduring and suffering is something that no other human being could possibly understand.
That's a fact, right? That you're there and you are thinking to yourself, I understand that people get sober from this. I understand people have done it, but no one is as bad off as I am. And no one, like, it hasn't gotten this bad with anyone else on the face of the earth. And so it's pointless for me to step forward and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take some action here. And that's just absolute bullshit, right? Like, we are run-of-the-mill, garden variety, dime a dozen drug addicts. Whether or not, like, that's what's at the core of my book, quite frankly, is that there's all this weird, crazy stuff. I had access to all of these people and David Copperfield and
right. You're the ultimate, like, don't you know who I think I am? And this mashup of like, sort of an overinflated ego with massive insecurity.
Absolutely. That's precisely what I was. But at its core, I'm a common drug addict, and it's an incredibly common story, and there is a path out, but no one else can put you on that path. You have to be willing to say, okay, I'm ready to sort of start my walk down this path. And no one can say it for you. I can't say it for you. Parents can't say it for you. Wives, children, husbands. It's not going to happen until you're ready to say, all right, let's do this.
Right. And so what about the person who's listening, who has that person in their life that's suffering and they feel powerless to help that person? I mean, I get tons of emails like this, like, I don't know what to do. My spouse, my boyfriend, my girl, whatever.
I get a lot of those emails. Yeah.
And it's like, you kind of spoke to it already. It's about willingness, and willingness is something that you cannot compel in another individual. Short of their willingness, you're pretty limited in how you can, show up for somebody in this situation.
You are. It's an awful position to be in, to watch someone that you love and care about, slowly kill themselves, because that's precisely what's happening. And worse, hear them deny it and get angry at you for suggesting it. So I have a tremendous amount of love and respect for the people that are in the lives of addicts and stay in those lives and continue to be loving and supportive. And I admire that, and am grateful, so grateful that there are people out there like that. I think it's incredibly important to make sure that you're not enabling an addict. It can be really easy to do that. And I don't recommend doing that, but I also don't recommend shutting them out of your life. I think there's some in between, and that's where you should live. Be supportive. Don't stop loving.
And take care of yourself in the meantime.
And absolutely, right, as you say, anytime you get on a plane, make sure your oxygen mask is on first before you, go to help others. Like, take care of yourself, and that is incredibly important. But listen, call them out on their shit also, forgive the language, but like, don't just see behavior that is telling and off and ignore it, call them on it. Don't do it in an aggressive way, but call them on it. Let them know that you're on to them. They're going to deny it. They're going to lie to you, but, be loving and supportive, but don't let them get away with it.
100%. We did it.
We did it, man.
It's good.
Yeah, it was great.
That was pretty good. How you feel?
I feel really good.
You feel all right?
I feel really good. I feel like...
You don't feel like you did when you sat next to Dr. Drew on that flight? And he killed your high?
He was the ultimate buzzkill,
No.
Dr. Drew.
All right.
I think the only thing that could make this even one notch better would be like a little Rick Springfield to just take us
Right.
out.
Well, there's a guitar behind you if you want to play it and sing it. You're more than welcome to.
Next time.
All right, man. Thanks. So the book is called As Needed for Pain. As I said, I love a good addiction yarn, and I'm not done with this book yet. I'm just cracking into it, but it's quite a yarn. So congratulations on it. I think it's going to help a lot of people. Check it out. Even if you just want to read about stories with rock stars in the back of limos, or trying to cop heroin in MacArthur Park, and I mean, there's a lot of banana shit in this book, and it's super entertaining, but also really speaks to the heart of what this disease is and how to see your way through it. So thank you for your service.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
All right, man. And if you want to connect with with Dan. What's the best way? Dan at Dan Perez NY on Twitter.
So at Dan Paris NY.
Paris. I did it wrong.
That's all right, man. It happens.
Perez.
It happens all the time.
Here's the other thing. Like, you didn't read your audiobook.
I know I didn't.
And the guy says Perez.
I know, and I'm like,
and I know it's Paris.
I have such an issue with that, but it is what it is.
Why didn't you read your audiobook?
You know, HarperCollins was like, we really want to have an actor do this, and I was like, okay.
They told me that too, and I was like, no way.
And my editor was like, if you really want, but we recommend. And I was like, all right, whatever. And so I should have. So it's Dan Paris. So at Instagram, it's Dan_Paris PERES, and Twitter it's at Dan Paris, also PERES NY. Yeah, that's where I am.
All right, cool, man. And Jeff, we missed you.
Yeah, Jeff.
Next time we'll do it, all three of us together. All right, peace. Let's.